Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. My name is Jonathan Dickstein, and I'm professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta and the lead organizer of our Vegan Studies Initiative. I am here today with Professor Dinesh Wadiwel to talk not just about his work, but also a little bit about the course he's offering us in this summer. So we're in summer 2026. For those of you interested in the course, that course will launch in August of 2026. And for those of you listening later, the course is still available well beyond that date. So first off, Dinesh, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
Wonderful. So in the course materials, in this podcast materials, a lot about you will be kind of made available. Your bio, your history, your CV. And so that can be covered elsewhere. What I like to do is kind of penetrate some other areas of interest and inquiry that may orbit, I'd say, the course itself. So what I ask virtually everyone who comes onto the podcast, when I'm the host at least, is how did you first get radicalized for animals? And when I say that, this is a different question that I think some people interpret, which is like, when did you become vegetarian or when did you become vegan? That's a different question. Or this idea that, like caring about animals isn't radical. But in our society, right, to be radicalized in a certain way is against the status quo of thinking, say, about animals. So when did that first happen to you or happen for you?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and I like the way you framed it. I will probably say part of it is interlinked with dietary choice. And for me, I think as a teenager, I started to question how we treated animals and just started to notice the disjunction between our narratives around how we imagine that we treat animals and the realities. As a probably 16-year-old, I was taken out by my family. My parents knew a professional fisher person who took us out on a boat, and he proceeded to catch these large salmon who died on the deck in front of me. And that was actually the moment that I made a decision to stop eating meat. I should say that I grew up in a maybe different context from mainstream Australians. So I live in Sydney, Australia, in that I'm South Asian origin. So in my family, the announcement that I was going to be a vegetarian wasn't greeted with any hostility. And that's because I'm particularly South Indian origin, and there are lots of family members, extended family members who are vegetarians. So in some ways, actually, when I went vegetarian, this prompted my father, who's a strict Hindu, to also become vegetarian. So it was seen as maybe a kind of positive thing. Though I wouldn't say this is radical in any way. So at this point, I didn't extend this to a broader theory about how animals should be treated in our society. In my early years at university, so late teens, early 20s, I tried to read voraciously, and I read the classics. I read Peter Singer, I read Tom Regan, I read Carol J. Adams. And maybe apart from Carol J. Adams, I wasn't that impressed by lots of the scholarship I read. One reason, and this will come back to this, one reason is that I was reading a lot of Marx and left theory, and I wasn't convinced that we had a particularly strong structural account for how we treat animals. So there was lots of emphasis on individual ethics. But it didn't seem to do justice to the problem that I saw. But it was only later that I'd say that I was more strongly radicalized, if that's the right word. And it was when I was doing my PhD. So I did a PhD in political philosophy, largely focused on the evolution of political sovereignty in nation states, but with a lot of focus on how nation states evolved in their use of violence. So, by the way, I never published my PhD thesis, but I became very interested in how violence evolved and spent a lot of time looking at torture, particularly the evolution of torture in the 20th century. And in the midst of that, I just started to realize that I couldn't escape the commonalities between let's say, the industrialization of torture in the 20th century and the way that this seemed to speak to the industrialization of meat production. I'm not at all saying that the two are identical, but that some of the same techniques and rationalities seem to haunt both. And it was at that point I started writing my first book, The War Against Animals. So while I was finishing my PhD, I started work on the war against animals with a very clear idea that I wanted to put forward a view that we're kind of facing a systemic problem that needs a systemic solution. So I think this is the point at which I really started to radicalize. It's also the point where I started moving beyond the comfort of, say, my vegetarianism towards veganism and mixing with, I'd say, animal rights types, starting to engage with people who had more radical views around how we treat animals in our society.
That's fascinating. I think I'm especially, there's earlier parts of the story that are interesting too. Kind of, I was thinking the distinction between your upbringing and, say, my own, in which, I didn't know a vegetarian until I went to college and a friend was vegan and I didn't even know really what that meant. Like, I didn't know what vegetarianism was until I was almost 20 years old. Like, I had never encountered it. And that's not even the thought of like pivoting in that direction or why I would do that. But I find striking is, like you said, that very early on in your PhD studies, is that this very early concern for kind of the structural predicament of animals and structural solution, which is it's at odds with, right, the kind of the typical way in which animal justice, animal liberation, animal rights kind of discourse plays out, I think still in the mainstream, which is like, oh, so you do animal work, that's an individual thing. Whereas when we're talking about really any form of equity, justice, equality, it seems to be much more structural and systemic. So I find it kind of like fascinating that for you early on, I think you found the individual focuses that you find in people like Singer or Reagan and elsewhere, Francione, whoever else, not really convincing or satisfying. But I guess as someone who studies, say, political theory and political history, it only kind of makes sense for you to be dialed in more into kind of these larger pictures. Would that be kind of accurate at time?
That's accurate. And it was partly because I was very engaged with left politics at the time, both intellectually and
Where did that come from? Where did that begin? How did you get radicalized just into leftist politics? Let's just say animal exclusionary leftist politics.
I was always nerdy at school, but I was studying economics at school and before I went to university. And we had this module on environmental economics. And in that module, I remember my teacher more or less confessing that there was no direct way that traditional market liberal economics could deal with the problem of environmental sustainability. And this was because the tendency of the market was to only respond to prices, and where environmental assets or goods or whatever, however we want to describe them, lack prices, then there's every incentive to just take them for free or to destroy the environment, right? I remember just sitting in this class just thinking, how have we organized our whole society on this economics, like this version of economics? That is, I could see this is in the, I'm 52 now, but so this was in the late 80s, early 90s, I could see that the planet was being destroyed at that point, and obviously that's accelerated. It was at that point that I started reading. I'd grown up in a household where my dad had broadly, let's say, I would say, to translate to this to US context, a sort of left Democrat style politics. But I think when I realized the problems with the market economy that we're amidst of, I became very interested in alternative economies. And it's at that point I started reading Marx. And when I went to university, I very quickly joined various left groups and became very interested intellectually and politically in those groups. But to come back to the origin of the question, what struck me when I read Singer and Reagan particularly was how very much based in a kind of liberal imaginary these forms of ethics were. And it was completely at odds with what I was reading and how change was imagined, because change was always imagined as collectives or revolutionary parties or transformative parties changing the structures of society to deal with oppression. And it was very strange to read these accounts from these liberal analytic philosophers who saw the process of change in a very different way. So I found it confronting. And so already at that point, it didn't seem plausible as a way to deal with the problem. So that said, I think I'd say this about both Peter Singer's Animal Liberation and Tom Regan's Case for Animal Rights. And I say this as a professional philosopher. Both books nearly perfect as arguments, as rational arguments about why we should treat animals better. I can't fault them in terms of the logical train, but it's not convincing in terms of how do we engage with the problem of societal change.
I think more and more I do find that convincing. I can see that. And there seems to, I think it's interesting. It seems like you've come from a background that was kind of critical of capitalism before you really started thinking seriously about animals so much. And a lot of people come at it actually from the other way. They might read individuals like Singer and Reagan, get convinced in this very analytic philosophy mode and be convinced, and then slowly realize how much maybe the horizon, that liberatory horizon, is impossible under, say, a structure like capitalism. And I I appreciate your insight you were describing in your environmental economics course, because, right, it's that old joke when someone says, yes, something like communism looks good on paper, but it doesn't work out in practice. And you say, like, but capitalism doesn't even look good on paper. You know, it also doesn't work in practice, but on paper it looks terrible. And I think the way that I think about it, but I like the way you said it too, is that it's kind of unbelievable that we've been conditioned to buy into a system that puts no intrinsic value on well-being, right? On the well-being of individuals or societies, and hence you would never have an environmental flourishing in a system that puts no value on individuals. And it seemed that for you, that was quite early to recognize. But I think for a lot of people, they realize later that, oh, wow, maybe if I do care about the environment and animals, I probably can also hold on to my capitalism as well. But if they just read people like Singer and Reagan, they might think they can, I guess is the point, because it's kind of divorced, a little bit divorced from these systems. Or at least that's how I kind of think about it now. I don't know if you would agree or not.
I think one issue we all have, and I include myself, is that we aren't very good students of history generally. And we don't realize that something I talk about in the course is that if you look at gross domestic product over the last 200 years, what's happened in the last 2 centuries is completely unprecedented in human history in terms of the explosion of production and consumption and explosion of money. And we forget that actually for most of human history, we organized economies and communities in very different ways. And we should learn from that. Doesn't mean that you might make an argument to say, well, maybe it's true that most humans have a higher standard of living than at any time in human history. But I think it's our duty to understand history and how could we reorganize the world and recognize that actually for many, many humans, forms of collective or common ownership, for example, were just standard. That doesn't mean that private property didn't exist, but lots of life was organized around more collective forms of economic organization, and they probably were more sustainable for the planet. And we could call that socialism or communism, whatever we want to call that. But because we lack that history, that perspective of history, I can understand why folks might read Singer or Reagan and say, well, capitalism is just what we're stuck with, and this is the best way we can organize this economic system to take care of animals. But we miss that, in a sense, and it's the argument in my book, that capitalism is tied up in the mess that we see today.
So then in someone like, I guess, Marx, because in both of your books, in War Against Animals and Animals in Capital, you're discussing that kind of influence. So what is it, I guess, about maybe Marx? I don't know, I was going to say it first, like what particularly drew you in, but I think I got a slice of that in what you've already said. But I guess if you were telling someone who's listening right now who really doesn't know much, say, about Marxist theory, like what are maybe one or two things that you find like extremely penetrating, extremely insightful, but that's kind of too small of a word to say, just like extremely powerful, whether it relates to animals or not, but what do you think are some kind of just very key, especially for you, right? I don't need you to give a kind of short course on Marx right now, but just for you, what do you find motivating, inspiring, insightful, monumental? I don't know. Those are the adjectives that come to mind.
Marx, I think Marx he was hard to pin down as an intellectual because he's an economist, he's a philosopher, he's a sociologist, he's all of these things. But I think like a classic sociologist, he takes what is everyday that appears normal or natural and makes it look strange. So the best sociology, in my view, does this. It takes everyday social practices or institutions and holds them up to a light and lets you look at them from different angles and say, oh, isn't that weird that we've organized the world this way? So Marx firstly does this with the prevailing economy that we're in the midst of, capitalism. But he notices some features that I think are very important, and this is why his critique remains important today. One thing I'd say that, for me, one important guidance his work offers is that this economic system, because it relies on a model of overproduction to create profits, it will suck everything into its midst to continue this particular process. So everything will be thrown under the bus to produce more money. And maybe to give this in a kind of more material way, the French economist Thomas Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century does this thing where he kind of adds up the global accounts, and he adds up the inputs and outputs, and he basically says there's 10% of the world's money that's missing. His view is that this money is sitting in offshore accounts, basically unaccounted for. I think about this and I think that's the planet that has been literally burnt up. So that 10% of the world's money can just sit in accounts for rich people doing nothing. So that's the world that we have created. It's not that we've created a world where we have economies that fundamentally meet subsistence needs and safeguard individuals from poverty and ensure flourishing. We've created a world where we endlessly produce just so that we can produce this essentially useless thing, which is called money. And that, I think, is a lesson that you find in Marx in Capital, the absurdity of that system. So that's guiding for me because it also tells us the bittersweet story about animals is that it's not just that we have anthropocentric or speciesist attitudes towards animals. It's that attitude to the world met with the force of capitalism and led to this overproduction being applied to animals, so that we have bred billions of animals into existence every year. We've pillaged the seas of trillions of fish every year, not because we need them, but because money was the goal. And that to me is an extraordinary tragedy. And so that's why I think Marx remains important, because he highlights that tragedy.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, I suppose, this kind of spiral that never satisfies at all, right? Even in this hyper over accumulation of money that can never be spent either, right? And
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Elon Musk became a trillionaire, and then I think yesterday was not a trillionaire anymore or something like that. He and others who have that much money can never spend that money in their lifetime. They just lack the capacity to actually use that money in their life. It's completely abstract. But Marx tells us that that money isn't the result of their work. It's actually lives that have been burnt up to produce that money. And of course, for Marx, he was looking at the English factory and the way that adults were having their lives literally shortened by the production process through injury, through early death, but also children being shoved into mines and working 14 hours and having their life destroyed by this production system. So this, to me, that money is life turned into money. And of course, we see this in a brutally frank way when we look at what we do to animals. It's right in front of us that lives are extinguished, not because we need them, but because of money.
So if I'm going to kind of, it's not how you meant it, but you're saying that, and I agree with you. I think that there was a period in time in which kind of the notions of, say, speciesism, certain forms of anthropocentrism, anthropocentric speciesism, and so on weren't even like terms kind of in the mainstream lexicon. And I write about this when I write about things on veganism. I say we have to revisit it now because we have a different category. We have so much of a different language than we ever had then. But I would say, riffing off what you said earlier, I think there's like a way in which the way that we treat animals it's not just anthropocentrism, and it's certainly not just speciesism. There's just certain unbelievably deep and integrated ways in which certain systems it's not even that they can't function, is that we can't even conceive of them without animals. And so I guess I'm curious then, what do you find to be some of these maybe fundamental or unique problems for animals under this current system? And excuse me for saying animals, right? Because not just in the typical way that we should kind of group animals as this kind of faceless and personalityless mass, but just because they are involved in so many different sectors and so many different ways, satisfying so many different kind of use values, exchange values, and so on. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what are some ways that the embeddedness is unique in the case for animals?
I think one of the main case examples I use in the book is the factory farm. And it's an interesting site to pick because if you read, say, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, this is also the site that is the starting point for the analysis. So it's the peculiar brutality that animals experience, the cold brutality that animals experience within the factory farm that inspires Singer to call this out and to describe a kind of speciesism and then apply this utilitarian calculus to say, if we took into account the sentience of animals, then we wouldn't do these things to animals. Which again, as I mentioned, I think the argument is flawless within a particular context. You can't really argue against it. But I think what I would say is, isn't it interesting that we have produced the factory farm at this point? And the factory farm is not, and certainly the argument I make in the book, is not purely the outcome of speciesism, or what I call in the book hierarchical anthropocentrism, but actually it's the kind of handshake between that particular attitude towards animals, this sort of human supremacy, and the capitalist production process. So one aspect of this is what I mentioned before, the overproduction model of capitalism, where the motivation for production isn't something that people need, but producing something for profit. And to give you an example before we look at animals, I think something like bottled water is a really good example. Consumers didn't need we didn't need bottled water. But at some point, capitalism decided that producing bottles of water and dumping these onto consumers was going to be an appealing profit strategy. And they succeeded at the cost of the planet, to be honest. They succeeded in doing this. Here, a commodity is overproduced, not because we need it, but because it is profitable to produce it. And this then shapes consumption later. We have similar stories when it comes to meat. So one example is chicken consumption, which at the turn of the 20th century, very few humans ate chickens, but now they are the most consumed land-based animal on the planet. And fundamentally, our economic system, because chickens were easy to industrialize and to produce in industrial contexts, capitalism has adjusted the diets of most of the world's population through this overproduction strategy in relation to chickens. For chickens, it's been an absolute disaster. So that's one aspect I think is an example of, in a sense, a part of the story of the factory farm and its overproduction model, but also what it materially does for animals in a way that you couldn't even dream of it if you just, 500 years ago. I don't think you could dream of what we do, right? And even if you made an argument that humans were speciesist 500 years ago, they could never dream of the factory farm. Certainly that's something I argue in the book. Maybe I should just give you two other examples that I use in the book and I talk about in the course for Arihanta. We've also seen a particular style or pattern within animal agriculture that is purely driven by the peculiar form of intensification that happens under capitalist economics. So in the book, I make an argument, and we'll get into this in the course. I make an argument that we should recognize animal labor time. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of the argument here. But what I'd say is that one outcome of this is to notice that in some ways, the shortening of animal lives was a predictable tendency of capitalism because it always seeks to reduce turnover time and create efficiencies in labor time. A second predictable outcome would be that producers would seek to increase yield, i.e. increase the net weight that the animal produces that can be converted into meat. Now, or dairy products. Now that these two particular forces are so apparent within animal agriculture that we have both shortened the lives of, say, chickens, but increased their weight at the same time. This is firstly the tragedy of what's happened to chickens, but it's also very clearly a result of the capitalist production process that these two tendencies have emerged. Once again, this for me highlights that we're not dealing with just speciesism or hierarchical anthropocentrism. We're dealing with actually a kind of hybrid or a handshake between that and the capitalist economic system that has produced a particular reality. So going back to Singer, and something I mention in my book, is that in a sense, it's odd that for Singer, this arrives as a kind of ethical problem mediated through a kind of utilitarian calculus. When actually what Singer was looking at was the peculiar outcome of a historical process about a kind of speciesist or hierarchical anthropocentric logic meeting with the market and producing a particular horror that has never been seen in human history before. And that is what Singer is trying to theorize. So in a sense, my book tries to do this, but to really put capitalism in focus here.
Oh, fascinating. No, and I think that is so essential to point out, to see at times when we are looking at certain, say, social phenomena and realizing that not only are they not the only way things could have shaken out, but that they would be unfathomable to individuals, say, only a few hundred years ago. Like they would be absurd if they were just trying to think what a future might look like. But now when the extraterrestrials come and we're long gone, they're just going to find plastic and chicken bones and be wondering what possible society came before. I guess it made me think about something I had thought about a while ago, and I guess I wasn't planning on asking this, but it seems ripe, which is that, and maybe it relates to kind of what Singer was working through as well, which is that because the way that capitalism treats labor in both its alienating, but what I would say the kind of anonymizing function, right? To anonymize through a wage and through any kind of relationship to the task at hand, that when one is at least no longer wage working, at least in their minds in this period, it becomes the only time where they get to exercise freedom, as it were. And they have to be situated in this society that also puts value on this kind of freedom to, say, found yourself as an individual. And I find that to be convincing because of the ways in which, at least under capitalism, your time off the clock to consume in certain fashions is pretty much unlimited, except for a few taboo corners that we kind of make consumption, like, like child pornography, right? We kind of have these kind of limits and say, look, you can do whatever you want. You can buy Jell-O and fill a bathtub and read a book in it, and we don't care. You do whatever you want. And I guess I'm curious. The reason I say that is because I know you've written about this as well, as the way in which individuals' kind of consumption of meat or consumption practices are very hard to change, but it's not this typical kind of like taste, access, affordability, but because it's so much linked to their kind of world creating and who they are within it. And I'm just curious if you want to talk about that a little bit, because for me, when I think about it, it is so much related to the backdrop of capitalism, and that a lot of the resistance that we might face in, say, I don't want to just talk about dietary changes, but I'm talking more about even integrating animals into a politic, makes individuals think that, like, now I can't kind of exercise freedom, which is really the only thing keeping me sane in a certain way. And I'm just curious. I don't think I put that together in kind of the clearest argument, I would say, but I'm curious just what you think about those forces.
I think it's a really great question. And there's so much to say about it. I do think we have an impoverished view of freedom in contemporary societies. So I'm a big fan of the Jamaican American sociologist Orlando Patterson, who's late Orlando Patterson, and his book Slavery and Social Death. And he has this amazing chapter, I think it's chapter 2, where he talks about freedom. And he makes this point that in ancient societies, typically the freedom was not clearly articulated as a strong value. But typically freedom was not understood in the way that we understand it today, as the experience of not being inhibited or fettered by others. So typically the free individual in, say, ancient Greece or Rome was somebody who had mutual ties of obligation to other people. And Patterson makes the point that actually being free of obligation in the ancient world was a fast track to slavery. So if you didn't have ties of mutual obligation, that's typically when you become vulnerable to being captured and made a slave. He argues that obviously this changes in modern societies, and we have a strong idea of freedom as being about non-interference. And he argues, in a sense, that racial slavery provides a model for what freedom is. So racial slavery, in a way, produces in the modern world an idea that being free is not being a slave. All of that said, I think Marx offers a different provocation, let's say, because Marx reminds us that the way that capitalism works is that for human wage workers, freedom is about free time. and how much free time you have from work. So we are obliged, most people are obliged to work in order to survive. And this means that in order to earn a wage, they must submit their time, their labor time, to be used by another party. And their free time is their genuine time for freedom. But this time, in some ways, as you point to, is in some ways measured, the quality of that freedom is increasingly measured by your capacity to spend your wage in the ways that you choose during your free time. The point I make in the book is that if this is tied up with meat consumption, then maybe it's no surprise that we get such strong kickback from individuals who feel that their freedom is being threatened by any suggestion that they should change their dietary practices. Because individuals, in a way, have been emboldened with the idea that spending their money in the market is equivalent to political or individual freedom. As I point out in the book, I think this has some implications for the politics of veganism, both in the sense that we could play into this argument and take the view that the ultimate way that you can demonstrate your ethics is by choosing to purchase vegan products in a market. But we also then forget that this power to choose is proportional to the amount of money you have in the market and how much free time you have. And it misses that actually for lots of humanity, many humans have very low wage work and long hours of work and actually don't have the same choices as same consumers. And by the way, something I talk about in the course, this doesn't mean I'm arguing against veganism.
Yeah, of course not.
At all. It's to really critically understand how has veganism arisen within this context where, in a weird way, freedom becomes at stake, and an impoverished view of freedom too.
I think that's just it. I mean, I think I've been trying, at least in my own circles, to stress this for such a long time that right when you are in a certain position in which either your current behaviors or your ability to modify those behaviors is higher than many others, then your kind of ability to adopt a different lens and way of life is going to be much easier and much more available than for those many individuals who have not been. And that's almost not even without even entering into the entire discourse around what happens to, say, dehumanized, animalized populations and the kind of desire to protect yourself by kind of moving in a certain direction away from animals. And you can move away from animals the more that you continue to treat them as different than yourself, right? As less than a kind of. And so I'm saying that's not even brought into that equation just yet. But I just mean to wrap that all into the same logic that yes, I think you can take a very pro or highly sympathetic vegan stance, but also not fall into the trap of not looking historically, not looking politically, not looking kind of racially or through gender ability lenses. So yeah, I would agree with that completely.
By the way, it's a provocation as well to think about, and so I don't want to reject ethics completely. It's a provocation to think about what are the ethical frames we're using. So if we take an ethical frame that says we have a moral imperative to go vegan and we should spread this moral imperative, and this asks people to forsake their freedoms in a market and choose the right ethical thing, that in a sense produces or signifies that this choice is a kind of burden or it's a restriction on. It doesn't get out of that logic. Whereas again, I mean, it's going back to what I said about my upbringing and, I think resonates with what I understand as, say, Jain ethics. There are elements where we could think about this as a call to a kind of flourishing, where what is offered by veganism is a freedom that is not accessible otherwise. And so I think there's some different ways we can think about it, but we haven't because of the frameworks we inherit.
That's true, and we also don't have time for it. So I certainly want to get to at least one other topic, but I do also, I'm very curious about your thoughts some other time about kind of also this, I want to say obsession, but focus on like consumption as so morally signifying. And I don't mean consumption like buying things necessarily. I just mean this notion of like putting things in one's body as this like somehow signifying a grander moral transgression than some other form of activity that also might just be decimating humans, non-humans, and so on. And I know this is a typical gotcha of the kind of non-vegan or anti-vegan left or even non-left. But I do find it is a bit of an obsession with consumption, kind of like integration into one's own body. And I think I don't say it in negative light. I think Jains historically also share a kind of obsession around consumables and what that means. Though their metaphysics has like a whole other take on it. But maybe we'll get to that some other time or during the Q&A. So those of you who are going to take the course, do it so you can come to the Q&A. And if you're listening to this later, well, you should watch the Q&As anyway, because we might talk about that. So before, I have a couple of questions, but I think because we were on that topic, I really am curious then, given all of these factors, all of these dynamics, then what do you think are paths forward for, say, individuals working in animal ethics, animal politics, among the, as I said earlier, the kind of animal exclusionary left, right? This seems to have been the kind of million-dollar question for a long time. And yeah, I'm just curious, like, what you think? Are there any avenues, any tactics, any ways of being, of listening, of speaking that you think could be helpful?
It's a hard question. I wish I could answer it, but let me try. I think we need to start with acknowledging the reality of why the antagonism is there. So why has the left, by and large, been uninterested in the cause of animals, or sometimes openly antagonistic to it? There's a German cultural thinker I really love, Fahim Amir, who makes this statement that when it comes to animals, the left turns right, which I think is absolutely accurate. And John Sanban-Motsu also makes a similar statement in one of his works. So I think there's something absolutely accurate about this. I think my book, I hope, maybe tells us why this is. And the argument I make in the book is that animals are, in a sense, a kind of structural class that have been produced. So animals used for food are a kind of class or economic class that have been produced within capitalism, whose interests don't align with those of the human labor force. So just to unpack that a little bit, in a kind of Marxist analysis, economic class is you're a working class person, so you don't own the means of production, or you are the capitalist of the bourgeoisie and you own the means of production. This is largely antagonistic because the interests don't align. The capitalist wants to rip off the worker just wants to survive. I make an argument in Animals and Capital that actually if we look at the structural positioning of animals, their interests in no way coincide with those of the human labor force. One reason is that animals are positioned as raw materials to make money. But secondly, importantly, they become the consumption commodities at the end that humans buy. And as we talked about, in some ways actually are loaded up with these ideas of freedom and choice. From this standpoint, I think it's useful to just recognize that and maybe there was no actual reason why the left should have been interested in animals. And often the argument goes, well, the left is usually interested in oppression and trying to produce non-oppressive worlds. Why haven't they been interested in animals? Well, I'd say actually structurally, there's no reason for solidarity. The solidarity, though, comes when we actually have shared goals. And in a sense, that's where I would place my emphasis. So I know that there are people within animal advocacy or scholars who sort of talk about models of total liberation and imagine that we can all just be on the same platform. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'd say that we can coalesce or agree where we agree on goals. So one example would be just a meta goal. At this point, in my view, our economic system is completely incompatible with the survival of the human species. I just think it's incompatible with where societies will go. And as we keep going forward, as climate change keeps destroying the means of the reproduction of life on the planet, it will change. I assume it's going to change politics, and we're going to see stronger calls for alternative models from the left. Here, I think there's a role for animal advocacy to have a view about where we're going and to imagine economies that are about flourishing, not just for humans, but for life in general. We have to be part of those conversations with environmentalists, with Marxists, with leftists. And that, in a sense, is part of the goal of the book, is to give us tools for that conversation. But it also affects our kind of week on, week off strategies, right? So animal movements, animal advocates have largely been, I'd say, not engaged with other social movements, and particularly social movements that align with either anti-capitalist movements or movements that try to safeguard or protect individuals from class-based forms of oppression. So to give you one example, over the last 100 years, capitalism has increased line speeds within capitalist production. It does so because of the overproduction model of capitalism. You put more in, you get more out. You speed up processes, you're going to get more meat. This is a disaster for animals because it increases the volume of animals that are brought into this world through forms of forced reproduction and subject to the hellish conditions of concentrated animal agriculture. And of course, increases the volume of animals who have to be killed in order to become meat. But it's also a disaster for the workers that do have to work in these facilities. And that's because, as we know, this work becomes more and more dangerous, becomes heavy, it starts to destroy bodies, and unions are actively trying to safeguard the rights of workers who do have to work in these facilities. To me, there's an obvious space for shared working in this area. We're not going to agree. Animal advocates have different goals, right? End goals. But there's every reason for tactical alliances and maybe the kind of longer term goal about building alliances with groups that are seeking fairer economies or economies that promote wider conceptions of flourishing. Maybe that's going to sustain us in building some of these alliances with people that we don't necessarily imagine as our friends. So I think that's one lesson from the book, is that taking a more structural point of view gets out of a kind of a politics which is just purely fueled by moral argument and is instead interested in what tactics do we need to achieve, hopefully, shared goals for a different future.
Really well said. And I do, when I reflect on maybe not as much animal advocacy as in my kind of sphere these days, but I also look back and find it remarkable, whether in the moral arguments and earlier thinkers, how much animal issues were continually framed in the kind of narrative of suffering and reduction of suffering, which I almost never heard that narrative being the starting point in human justice struggles, which were always framed politically, right, in the kind of rhetoric of something like domination, liberation, or colonialism, patriarchy. And I think that's maybe at an inception a point at which it kind of shot itself in the foot at treating animal issues as this almost kind of like abstract environmental ethics suffering calculation, whereas everybody on the left wasn't doing that in human justice struggles. They were looking more at the afterlife of slavery, of colonialism, the present reality of colonialism, and so on. And I these days find it kind of odd too, because I don't think that something like animal liberation is a project of reducing suffering. That's not what liberation isn't the liberation from all suffering. I mean, anyone who studies South Asian religions knows that that's not going to happen in any mortal lifetime. So I kind of agree. It's just like another way that I've been thinking about it, where I think that the language around animals has kind of started in a place and originally moved in a direction that was just so dissimilar than other human justice movements. And over time, it's kind of like worked its way back, but I guess never forged that alignment from the inception. And like you said, that doesn't even speak to the fact that under capitalism, you're almost naturally antagonistic to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, I think and maybe all that said, if we think about the history of that modern animal rights movement, I should, and obviously you understand this, we're talking about the way that animal rights has evolved within largely global North context. And of course, there's a longer conversation around animals that happens in a range of different cultures and faiths that's been going on for centuries, right? So we know that, right?
Absolutely.
But if we think about this modern moment, I think it's interesting and maybe unique that the modern animal rights movement in the global North is founded effectively in analytic philosophy departments. To me, this is quite unique, right? So if we think about other social movements, they typically arise in different spaces. It's not that academics aren't involved in it, but typically it's other spaces of contestation that the theorization starts to happen. I also say that both Regan and Singer, let's assume that they're the pivotal figures in the story we're talking about. They're both very committed to a kind of liberal political project that happens to largely be in conformity with the capitalist project. And something I've noted in other talks is that both Singer and Regan are writing at this point at which neoliberal philosophies and libertarianism is taking hold within analytic philosophy departments. And neither of them offer a very strong counter-narrative. That an aside, the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick, he reviews Singer's book early on and gives it the stamp of approval, reviews Regan later, doesn't really approve of Regan, but it illustrates in a way the sense that these founding figures were actually in conversation with the neoliberalization of our economies and largely did not produce philosophies that contested this particular trend in our economies. Here, I'm not meaning to say they should have done otherwise. They were doing what professional philosophers do. But I think recognizing that history helps us to understand the particular form that modern animal rights theory took and why it was so different from other theory that was happening at the same time. I mean, I think about an example would be the social model of disability, which arose in the 70s and 80s within sociology departments, was at least founded upon a kind of Marxist approach to sociology. That's sort of the look at some of the early social model theorists, they're largely trying to theorize oppression in an institutional way. So different from what happened within the history of animal rights. And I think that's just acknowledging that is important in terms of that intellectual history. And maybe also acknowledging the quite unique way that animal rights movements were shaped by effectively analytic philosophy, which to me seems quite unique and strange in that history.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe you did co-edit a text on Foucault and animals. Is that correct?
I did.
So maybe that would have been an interesting course if that was kind of the course that the animal rights movement had taken, is more from kind of a Foucaultian trajectory. I mean, ideally from a Marxist one, but at least something else. One can wonder how different things may have played out. So I guess just wrapping up, I mean, we did talk about so many things, and I think there's a number of topics we touched on that students will dive into your course. But I guess really, is there, I was going to ask what can students expect in the course, but I actually would rather ask, who do you think this course is good for? Or why do you think this is like a really helpful way to digest the material that you've studied for so long and have written about?
The book, so the book ultimately was written for both animal advocates and leftists. So the goal of the book was to give animal advocates an insight into a critical perspective on our economies and a perspective on how the capitalist economy is intermeshed, if you like, in the tragedy that is unfolding around animals or has been unfolding. But the book is also for leftists. It's for people who are interested in challenging oppression, concerned about the capitalist economy, to also give those folks an understanding about the place of animals within that story. The book is, in many sections, quite complex, and hopefully the course gives students a bit of a sense about Marx. And so part of the course is really teaching students about how Marx saw the world, but also how animals are potentially could be tied up in that theorization in ways that are productive for how we move forward.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it, and I'm really excited that this is the first time we'll be offering a course that's really doing a focused analysis of a text with the author. Kind of, we like to say, the first in our book club series of courses at Arihanta. So just want to say, Dinesh, thank you so much for being here. This has been a really kind of dense yet light and fun conversation around some of the themes of your course, but also adjacent themes. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's been great. I'm looking forward to the course.
Great. So I want to thank you all for listening. And yes, I hope to see you, or at least see you in the course or another course. But please tune in next time for the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum, spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more, can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.